When you're talking to customers, you need to be listening to their pain, not their prescription. There's that saying, customer is always right. Well, no, actually in product and in software and in a lot of cases, the customer is almost never right.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
On this week's show, we're going to discuss one of the most important concepts in startup life, conviction. It underlines everything you do in your startup and in your operator journey. We're going to talk about what conviction is, why it's important, what happens if you don't have it, and how to go get it and propagate it in your company. It's going to be a compelling conversation. It's super important, super subtle, and super essential to your journey as a startup founder. So stay tuned. All of that and more coming up straight after the break.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance with SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Welcome back. I have conviction that this is going to be a fantastic episode, and just before we bust into it, I wanted to remind you all about the TSP Pact. Those of you who are regular listeners know that all we ask in return for this fire hose of free and valuable content is for you to follow us, give us a rating and review in your favorite listening app, subscribe to us on YouTube, and give us a shout out on LinkedIn or wherever it is that you have your audience. It means so much to us. It helps us grow the show, continue to get fantastic guests, and keep doing this for all of you. Thanks so much. Now, Chris, let's talk about conviction.
Before we explain what the heck is conviction, let's first talk about why we've come to this topic. So, in my advisory work, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing, I meet a lot of founders who are sort of tied up in knots about what to do next, or they're really building a technology-backed services company with nothing that's really coalesced into a product. Things are moving slowly. They're maybe shipping a lot of things, but none of it's really laddering up to polished products and scale. There's a lot of dysfunction happening. And in a lot of cases, one of the root causes of this is actually a lack of conviction by the founders, by the CEO, and maybe some of the key leaders in the company. That's what we want to address today, is one of these root causes, which is conviction, and helping founders find their conviction. So what is conviction? Let's start there. Conviction, for me at least, is having clarity of purpose and executing toward that purpose with alacrity, to convert potentialities into a single, often embarrassingly narrow reality. It's about making a bet, and it's about overcoming your fear, your indecision, your doubt, maybe feeling those things, but choosing a single path and committing to it anyway.
Conviction is something that comes from inside. It is a view of the future that you are trying to create. This is really important in startups because otherwise you end up dissipating your energy. And Chris, you talked about founders being tied up in knots and things moving slowly and nothing laddering up to polished products. And the reason for that is that the world of business is brutal. I cannot emphasize this enough. Whatever you are trying to do, you will get knocked down so many times. You will try things and most of the time they won't work. You will have customers who give you feedback, who surprise you to the downside. And money, right? You're going to be running out of money all the time. You're always running out of money. You're just going to have all of these things that make turning your vision into reality really challenging. So the pressure to start to dissipate from that vision, to try to say, okay, how can I bring in money quickly? How can I do what the customer tells me? Or, abandon this thing because it doesn't seem to be working and try something else and thrash around. It's nearly the default. If you don't have that strong momentum that comes from having conviction, or the strong tailwind, the strong North Star, whatever metaphor you want to use, then the natural state of things is you end up dissipating and become a technology-backed services business at best, or much more commonly, Chris, you just kind of end up dying slowly, which is the worst way, as we've talked about before, for any startup to die. Much better off dying quickly. But lacking that conviction, that North Star, means you're going to die slowly because you're going to be doing everything you can, compromising your own vision just in order to stay alive that little bit longer. And that's not what you want to be doing.
As you were talking, I was thinking about, you're saying that this chaos and difficulty and hedging and indecision is the default state. And it sort of reminded me of entropy, right? Entropy is the default state of the universe. And conviction in this metaphor is life. Life is the only counter-entropic force in the universe. It creates patterns. It works against entropy. So in this metaphor, entropy is life. The next thing we want to talk about is, why is this important? But you mentioned casually this idea that it's better in a startup to die quickly than to die slowly. That's not obvious to many founders, especially first-time founders. And it is one of the first reasons why a lack of conviction is bad, and why a higher degree of conviction than most people have is good. Because one of the main reasons that conviction tends to evaporate from a founder is like, oh my God, if I make a bet and it's wrong, we're going to die. And so we need to do lots of different things so that we can die more slowly, so that we have the chance to succeed over the long, long term. But as you alluded to, Yaniv, startups are about moving fast and breaking things. They're about momentum. They're about exponential curves. They're about raising capital to accelerate outcomes. And so they are about speed. A big part of it is about speed. And it would be better, and this is standard startup dogma that is antithetical or fundamentally different than traditional business. It is better to raise, execute, and find out you're wrong than to meander in zombie mode for weeks, months, or years in this kind of middling success. Because that's not the point of a startup, of a Silicon Valley style startup, which of course is the point of our entire show.
Now, it's interesting. As you spoke, Chris, I was actually putting myself in the shoes of a founder who's like, this sort of sounds like the opposite of conviction. And I think there's actually a really subtle distinction here between conviction and what you could call passion or something like that, right? Which is, one of the things you see with a founder is they become obsessed with the thing that they're trying to do. And so they will not give up on it. They are like, it's not working, so I'll just make compromise after compromise because I'm not willing to give up on this thing. Someone like that might be listening to this episode and saying, surely that's conviction. Isn't being willing to die, isn't that the lack of conviction? That's a really interesting piece a nuance to tease out here, right? Which is that you can be passionate about the problem space. You can try to solve that over a long period, but conviction is about the course of action that you're taking, about your guiding principles, whether it's a solution or an approach, I would say, not even a specific solution, right? You're like, okay, this is what this startup is trying to achieve. And we have this sense that we believe it's the right way, but it is very much something that you can update, right? So it's a belief, but not an article of faith. And maybe that's the difference here, right? Faith is a belief that is unshakable, whereas we're talking about a belief in the statistical sense, in the Bayesian sense, which is, I think this could be a great business, but I'm going to let that belief be guided by new evidence as it comes along. You have conviction in actually following through on that belief and taking it as far as it can take you. And this is really important, because if you have your conviction in the wrong place, you end up in this messy situation. You need to be willing to fail, and conviction is actually being willing to fail while pursuing that belief that you have.
There's a lot of terms here and a lot of interrelated concepts, and I think someone's head could be spinning. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is this idea that, the world is going to get you down, and people are going to sand off or deflate or distract or derail your original vision. And more often than not, when I meet a founder who is struggling, they've been distracted or derailed or deflated from their vision. And they've been convinced by dumb money or short-sighted friends that, hey, why don't you give up on that and go do this other lesser thing? Whether it's B2C, they'll tell them go do B2B, or if it's this ambitious idea, they'll tell them to do something much more simple. And very often their original idea was the right one, but their lack of conviction deflected them from that course. And so really what we're trying to say here is don't allow yourself to get deflected. And then oftentimes operators will try to execute something, but from a place of lack of conviction. And so they will compromise the execution of that thing before they even try. We're going to give you plenty of examples as we go through this. There are examples where healthcare companies or fintech companies will assume the regulation doesn't allow something and they'll compromise up front instead of figuring it out, pushing for it with conviction. Or they'll think about a B2C startup and they'll compromise and go do B2B because of a lack of conviction. Or they'll want to build one thing, but their customers have told them to build something else. And they're the ones who are willing to pay right now. And so instead of building a product, they'll deliver a service because of a lack of conviction. All of these aberrant, corruptive behaviors, at the root of them, a lack of appropriate conviction.
Yeah, let me add to that list also just building more and more features. I actually think that is a sign of a lack of conviction, because you also talked about listening to dumb money or listening to uninformed friends. I think one of the biggest things that causes this problem is listening to customers in the wrong way. There's that Henry Ford quote about if you ask people what they wanted, they would want a faster horse. So, I mean, the software version of that is if you ask people what they wanted is like they would just ask for more and more features, right? They don't understand. It is your job to figure out what it is that they need. But I think quite often what happens is you listen to your customers instead of learning from them about their need, you let them guide you on the solution. And that is actually a strong sign of insufficient conviction in what it is that you're building.
When you're talking to customers, you need to be listening to their pain, not their prescription. That's the distinction that Yaniv is drawing. You want to be listening to their problems, the underlying problems that they're experiencing. But very often their ideas for how to solve those problems are utterly wrong. There's that saying, customer is always right. Well, no, actually in product and in software and in a lot of cases, the customer is almost never right. Never right about the prescription that you should be following. And that's where conviction, again, is very, very important. Now, let's just talk about some of the reasons why in startup land, conviction is particularly important. It's more important than traditional business and the big companies. And it's because startups are unique, right? They're unique in the way I just finished describing, which is they need to go fast and they need to penetrate the morass of objections in the status quo rather than moving slowly and being in this zombie mode for weeks, months, and years. But also because they have limited resources, they have limited capital, they have limited runway, they can make, therefore, limited bets. There are only enough people around to do one thing really well. And so when you take all of those things and you add them together, hedging with your resources, hedging with your bets, hedging with doing more than one thing leads to a pretty shitty product, shitty execution, and ultimately the dreaded technology-backed services company where you're just selling anything to anyone who will buy and building whatever you sold.
I know we haven't talked about technology-backed services companies for a moment. So I think let's just have a quick aside here about the dreaded technology-backed services company. So fundamentally, a technology-backed services company is a company that is selling its time, not its product. So that's where the services comes in. Services businesses sell their time. There's nothing wrong with services businesses. In fact, services businesses can be wonderful if that's what you're setting out to build. And then you build it appropriately with the right cost structure, with the right philosophy, and so on. So we don't actually want to rag on technology-backed services companies in general.
No, we just want to encourage those founders and operators to go listen to the Services Business podcast instead of the Silicon Valley Startup podcast.
And, a mantra of know the game you're playing. I think why is it dreaded in this context is you're trying to build a Silicon Valley startup and you accidentally fall into a services company without ever realizing it. Instead of saying, we're selling by the hour, you're like, oh, we've got these, non-recurring expenses and blah, 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 and we're building this feature to close this enterprise deal. You can fool yourself for a long time that what you're doing is something other than services, that you're still building a product, but you're not really. And that is one of the things that happens with a lack of conviction, because again, you're doing bits and pieces of work, you're listening to your customers, you're scrapping around for $1 instead of saying, this is what I'm building. And generally, it's easier to make money at the beginning from services than it is from products. So of course, if you lack conviction and you're looking for these early signs of traction, such as revenue, and you need perhaps that revenue to keep operating, then that is where that siren song of the technology-backed services business comes in. And again, if you want to do a services business, then do that from the beginning. Don't allow yourself to be lured into it, because you will end up in a bad place with the kind of the worst of both worlds.
That's right. Which is part of the essential role of smart money in the business, right? Is that you're not having to chase and scrap for that dollar and rather able to build and maintain that conviction. So hopefully at this point, everybody listening is convinced that conviction is important and that it's uniquely important in startups. So the question then becomes, well, how do I get this conviction and how do I keep this conviction? How do I feel confident that the choices that I'm making are the right ones? That's probably what we're going to spend the bulk of the episode on, because let's just kind of take it as read that conviction is important and it's critical to your success. And let's assume for the moment you don't have it and you're looking for it. So we're going to talk about 7 or 10 bullets here about the different ways that together these things work to help you get and keep conviction. The first one is having a vision. This might seem obvious. People love to use the word vision and they bandy it around like it's going out of style. And they talk about a vision of, self-driving cars or AI that is conscious and self-aware. They feel like, okay, I've set the vision. It's 40,000 feet. I broadly know what the future looks like. I'm done, right? Chris and Yaniv said, I need a vision. I've got a vision. But what we're talking about here is not just vision at the very tippy top of your business, this big, broad 10, 20-year time horizon. I'm talking about vision for everything you do, both tactically and strategically. If you're building a new product, if you're building a feature, if you're building an org structure, if you're raising money, you need to have a vision for what great looks like. What does the ideal, the awesome, the brilliant version of this thing look like? Because most people, most of the time, pre-compromise when thinking about the tactical execution of their stuff. Just to give you a very pragmatic example, when I think about product strategy, which is still quite high level, or a product feature, which is a little bit more low level, I will throw out, I will ignore, I will set aside the technical constraints, the regulatory constraints, the design constraints, the business goals, and I will just ask myself one simple question. What does the user need? What is the ideal version of this for my user? Then, and only then, once we figure that out, do we even think about compromising judiciously and pragmatically, but more often just slicing that ideal into thin slices that we can execute over time and actually never or not really compromising at all. And so vision is essential here, not just at the 40,000 foot view, but at every layer down the stack for every decision and choice as you're working through your startup.
Yeah, a subtle but important thing there, Chris, is you talked about don't pre-compromise your vision. The difference between having ideals and being idealistic or naive, you're willing to make a compromise, but you don't make it too early. So pre-compromise is saying, before we've even defined the ideal, we're already beating ourselves down. And the famous design consultancy IDEO have their double diamond framework where they talk about divergent thinking and then convergent thinking. And in the divergent stage, the brainstorming stage, you're not allowed to say that's a bad idea. You're not allowed to say no, because what you're trying to do is come up with the best idea. So a vision is saying this is the ideal. But then when you get to execution mode, when you start to be convergent, of course, you need to then factor reality in a really sensible and intelligent way. And that's going to involve some other attributes that we're going to talk about later in this section, Chris. But if you never even define what good looks like, what is your North Star, what is the ideal, then there's no way you're going to come up with a good solution. Good compromise comes from knowing what you're compromising from. Pre-compromising is limiting your ability to ideate before you even define that ideal. And so I think that is really important, lest we be accused of being naive here, right? Ultimately, you need to put a product out into the world that's going to be full of compromises, but hopefully those compromises are intelligent and thoughtful and don't cut off the path towards achieving and manifesting as much as possible the core tenets of your vision.
That's right. There's lots of time, plenty of time for pragmatism and judicious compromise. That's not where you start, though. And Yaniv, I will say 9 times out of 10 when I'm working with a founder and with a startup, I'm bringing them all the way back up to the top of the stack and going, what is the ideal here? What's the vision? What have you already compromised? And we spend, quite a long time figuring that out in quite a bit of detail. The very next thing you got to do, and this might sound, contradictory, is to figure out the constraints. And so if you're saying, hey, we sell anything to anyone, anywhere, where our arms are open, there's never seen a deal we don't want to say no to. That is by definition a lack of conviction. It is a lack of specificity. It is far, far too broad. I was talking to a founder the other day and I said, yeah, you're going to need to get really very precise and very constrained, uncomfortably constrained, embarrassingly constrained about the problem you solve. And he said, oh, yeah, we've done that. We work only in communications. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Communications is like the fundamental substrate of everything everywhere, dude. That is not a constraint, right? If you are not embarrassed at a dinner party when someone asks you, what do you do? When you talk to other academics or domain experts in your space and what problem do you solve? And you are not wincing as you answer, you have not defined a narrow enough place to start. That narrow place to start is also the start of your conviction. It's the start of the thing you need to have conviction about. It's the thing that your conviction allows you to stick to. It's who are we serving and what are we doing for them? Before you can have conviction, you first need a narrow set of constraints from which to start the journey towards your vision, right? It's the starting point. It's the wedge in the world. That's the thing, that constraint, the who, what, where, when, and how, for that starting point, that's the thing you need to have conviction about. Because if you keep changing that, then everything else is like a whippy tail. It'll just go everywhere and you're ultimately spraying and praying.
This is where the compromise piece comes in, right? The not pre-compromise, but a compromise at the right time. And maybe you could argue this isn't even, compromise isn't the right word, but what we're saying is we have this vision, and maybe our vision is a particular type of tool that will revolutionize communications for everybody. I'm not saying that's necessarily a particularly good vision, but let's say that it is. To your point, Chris, without the constraints, it is a very naive, it's impossible to execute under the context of the resources and time that you have available, right? So what you need to say is, we start with, and this is your phrase, an embarrassingly narrow slice. And that is, we're saying, okay, we have this space and we're going to focus. We're going to laser focus on one of these things. I've used this metaphor before as well, that of a knife. How does a knife work? It works by having a very thin edge, which means you're concentrating whatever force that you put on the knife to a very narrow area. And that means that the pressure that is applied by that narrow area is high. And that is what sharpness means. That is why sharp knives can cut through things with the application of relatively little pressure, right? And so if you don't define those constraints, it is like you have created a completely blunt knife. You're not going to get anywhere. The more force you have, the blunter your knife can be. But at the beginning, you have very little force. So you need to have that super sharp knife. And that is about having those constraints. And so you want a solution that is awesome for someone rather than not awesome for everyone, right? And so, to the extent that you want to compromise and constrain, you wanted to do it kind of vertically, right? You want to have that narrow vertical slice, not that narrow horizontal slice where you have a product that doesn't serve anyone's needs very well, but you can say, oh, well, it's for everybody, right? And I think that's really important. Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, Flow Health, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
Now, the next few aspects of this we wanted to touch on, developing conviction in the absence of data, or the absence of perfect data or complete data. Because oftentimes the reason there's a lack of conviction is certainly a lack of vision or a lack of clear constraints. There's nothing to have conviction about. But here it's like, well, we might have an intuition or we have a notion of what we want to do, but there's no data, Chris. We have to go out and validate in the market, right? The reality is that startups are operating in a data-poor environment. You are disrupting the status quo. You are breaking the world as you know it. You are confronting domain dogma. There wasn't any data about how many people wanted an automobile when Henry Ford invented it. There was only data about the fact that people needed horses. And so there is not going to be perfect data. Now, of course, there's a lot of mechanisms out there to go get data, value prop testing, focus groups, and so on. But at the end of the day, you're not going to have perfect data, and therefore you're not going to have perfect conviction based on data. To substitute for that data, you need intuition, taste, and experience. You need people around you that you can lean on who have good intuition about these things. They have good taste about the way these things are done. And probably better, they have experience which has led them to good intuition and good taste. They've done this before, they've tried and failed, they've learned the lessons the hard way, and they can help you make intuitive, tasteful leaps that may not ultimately be right, but at least they're in the right direction, and to help you overcome that gap, that knowledge gap that often people need for conviction.
The way I like to think about it, I mentioned this already, and it's a little bit nerdy, but I think it's so valuable that it's worth going into, Chris, which is what I talk about Bayesian belief. This sort of comes from the field of statistics, where there's this one school of thought in statistics called Bayesian belief models, where the idea is rather than just relying on data alone, you come up with a belief that is data informed, but is also informed by other things, right? Like, I have a belief that the sun will rise tomorrow. I can base that on the several thousand sunrises I've experienced over my lifetime, but I can also base it on my understanding of Newtonian physics and a bunch of stuff. And so in the context of a product, the things that can inform belief can be things like my intuition and experience and so on, things that are not fully quantifiable, but nonetheless are valuable in informing my belief. And in a sense, your conviction, like I was saying before, is that belief. Now, the cool thing about Bayesian models is that the way they work when you get new information is you use that information to update your existing belief. So that's the difference between a belief and blind faith, is you start off incorporating everything you can to form that belief. If you have no data, then you form your belief based on things that are not data. You still might have beliefs. You still might have valid sources for that belief, right? Your intuition, your taste, your experience. As data comes in, and that can be talking to users, that can be information about how people are using your product, it can be your metrics, it can be your revenue. That data updates your belief. It doesn't throw out your belief, it updates it. And I think that's such a great framework for how you think about conviction in your startup. You have to start with those strong beliefs. The point of your Bayesian beliefs is at any given point in time, you have a fixed set of beliefs. You don't hold multiple sets of beliefs at the same time. They update over time. But at any given point in time, you're like, this is what we believe. And that is conviction. And that is what allows you to move fast and with coherence.
Yeah, that's really, really important, right? Because again, in my advisory work, I bump into a lot of founders, operators, CEOs. They believe a lot of things and they're not quite sure which of them to be true and which of them to be validated and which way to go. In those cases, a lot of what I'm doing is using my intuition, my taste, my experience to say, hey, of these 17 different possible things that may or may not be true, I can tell you from experience, from intuition, from taste, or even from just making a bet. These are the principles, these are the values, these are the things we're going to believe until otherwise proven. That immediately cuts the Gordian knot. It immediately eliminates the indecision and the hedging. Yep. And so just writing our principles down, our assumptions down, our beliefs down is incredibly powerful. You said this phrase, Yaniv, which we've talked about on the show a number of times, and I think it's so important to inculcate it in the community that listens to us. You do not want to be data-driven. You want to be data-informed. And so a practical example of this, Yaniv, you said when you might get feedback from your customer that changes your mind or updates your beliefs. More often than not, the feedback should not immediately change your belief. The feedback should be a data point amongst a set of data points filtered by your taste, intuition, and experience that actually leads eventually to an update in your belief. So I was just working on a very complicated product where we started doing user testing, putting the thing in front of users. After many months of design based on vision and constraints and intuition and taste, one of the customers said, I can't read this text on the thing. And immediately a team of 5 or 7 people were like, okay, we got to change the font on that thing. And I'm like, wait, stop. Are they looking at the Figma prototype? And is the Figma prototype resolution askew? And when you generate this in a web page, the font will be clearer and the font will be fine. And they're like, oh yeah, you're right. And so it's just a really simple, dumb example of like a random brain fart from a customer should not immediately update your intuition, your taste, and your experience.
Your belief has momentum because it is based on a whole bunch of stuff. And another new piece of data that comes in doesn't invalidate all the other things that already led to a given belief. Another phrase that is used in this context that I think fits perfectly well, but sometimes misunderstood, is strong opinions loosely held. And that again describes this way of thinking, right? Which is whatever your belief is at the time, act with the full confidence of that belief. Don't hedge. Don't be like, well, we sort of think this. A belief doesn't mean you're sure. A belief means this is your current best view of the situation, right? Our current belief is our choice of font sizes is appropriate. And I've got one data point that a person said they can't see it. But, we have all these other things. We've got a designer with 15 years experience. We've got our accessibility guidelines. They all say our font size choice is still appropriate. So we're going to file that piece of data away. Our belief might be slightly weaker than it was before we got that piece of data, but it's still our belief, and we're still going to act in accordance with that belief that the current font sizes are appropriate.
So now the next topic, the next way to develop and to keep conviction, it might sound actually quite similar to what we were just talking about, but it's actually quite different, which is faith. So the first one was about acting based on intuition, taste, and experience, and having the flexibility to update your beliefs appropriately about that taste, intuition, and experience. But for this point around faith, what I want to address is this tendency I've found in a lot of founders and operators to say, well, Chris, that's a great ideal, and that's great intuition and taste and experience, but I'm just not sure that we can execute that well. Here I'm trying to address this directly. You need to have faith that your team can execute well, or that you can build a better team. And so you can't compromise your conviction because you just don't think you're good enough. Or because well, geez, that would be cool, but I don't know if we're good enough to do that. You need to have faith in your ability to learn and iterate along the way, to update those priors, to update your strong opinions loosely held. You have to have faith in the process, and you have to have faith that the alternative is worse. The alternative being hedging, this diffuse energy across a broad set of things, is worse than making a bad bet, than a two-way door walked through confidently. And so that's what I mean by faith. It's really, really important for conviction.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. And I would still draw a distinction, though, between faith and blind faith. My interpretation of what you're talking about here is you need to act as if you can execute well. You need to act as if you will learn and iterate quickly. You need to act as if the alternative is worse, because otherwise you will never succeed. Now, it's not blind faith. That means if you can't execute well, you have the power to do something about that. You shouldn't fool yourself. You should act as if you can execute well. And if you can't, then fix it. But you fix it by figuring out how to execute well. That can be upgrading your systems, your processes, your people, whatever it needs to be. What you shouldn't do is say, we can't execute well, so let's accommodate ourselves to that reality, right? So the faith is about acting as if. There is no alternative to acting in this way. There is no alternative to acting as though you can execute well if you want to succeed in building a Silicon Valley style startup at scale. It simply doesn't happen with poor execution. So act as if you can execute well, and then do everything you can to make that true.
You know what, Yaniv? There's three really interesting aspects to this about executing well. Number one, if you don't believe your team knows how to execute well, then you are executing poorly. You are the one that's not executing well because you have built a bad team and are failing to improve the team. When you put a great vision powered by intuition and taste and experience, and you eliminate indecision and hedging, your team will likely rise to that occasion. They will rise to a better level of execution. Now, they may not rise to being as good as they need to be, but it will raise the bar. It'll help them to execute better. And then finally, if you ultimately need to hire better people, it's actually more possible to hire better people if you have that clarity, that conviction, and they can read it on your face. They can hear it in your voice. They believe it in your soul. And so hiring great or better people requires conviction in the first place. So in all of these cases, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you have faith, then faith shall be given to you, right? To bastardize a quote from the Bible.
Yes. People say you need to treat your staff like adults. And I think this is like the generalization of treating your staff like adults, because if you don't treat your staff like adults, then they will never be able to behave like adults, right? And so that means you're infantilizing them. If you treat them like adults and they're not able to rise to the occasion, if they're not able to behave like adults, then you need to do something about that, whether that is changing the people, changing the culture, changing something else. But you need to start by treating them like adults, because you will never get anywhere by treating your staff like children. Now, generalize that to every aspect. You need to run your company as though it is a well-functioning organization. Otherwise, you will never achieve anything of true value and scale.
The next and second last thing we wanted to talk about was the role of courage here. In a recent episode with Mike Scott, we talked about being a founder is an act of bravery. I think conviction is one of the underlying reasons why being a founder is an act of bravery. You have to have the courage of your convictions, right? You have to feel the fear, feel the tendency, the need, the desire to hedge, and yet have the conviction anyway.
Yeah.
This is not about a lack of fear, a lack of concern, a lack of engagement with the details and pragmatism, but it is understanding those things and doing it anyway. That is very, very important.
This is going back to what we were saying at the beginning of the episode, which is so much shit will go wrong. You know, we've had episodes recently on founder mental health, on imposter syndrome, and so on. And that is because building a startup is filled with failures. Every day, something will go wrong. You will have failed to live up to your own expectations or your own hopes and dreams and so on. It can be so easy to be discouraged. It can be so easy to start to doubt yourself. And that's where all of these anti-patterns we were talking about creep in, right? Where you're like, you jump at whatever the customers ask for you. You do anything you can to bring in revenue because it's a proof point. You start losing your conviction because if you lose belief in yourself, it is hard to have conviction in your vision, right? Because you're like, I've failed so many times already with this startup. Maybe I'm wrong. The courage that you're talking about here, Chris, is to process all of that, to say a lot of things have gone wrong. I'm learning. I'm afraid that this thing is a bad idea. I'm afraid that my friends will laugh at me. I'm afraid that it will fail, and yet I'm going to do the thing that I have conviction about doing anyway. That is the courage. It's the courage of facing your fears and staying the course, because anything else is something that you're going to regret later, because you're just not going to achieve what it is that you set out to achieve. And of course, having that courage will result either in great success or faster failure, and both of those are better outcomes than long, slow, painful failure. Believe us, we've seen it a lot of times.
Seen it, lived it,
Yeah.
cried about it. Yeah. Now, the final thing we're going to talk about in terms of getting and keeping conviction is leadership. You now, hopefully, Mr. and Mrs. Listener, have developed a playbook for getting conviction. Your job now is to inculcate, to propagate that conviction to the rest of your team. Now, you do that by sharing your convictions, sharing your vision, sharing the constraints, sharing the decisions you've made based on intuition, taste, and experience, bringing in advisors who have those things for you, developing your faith, believing in your team, and having the courage. You now need to go to your team and give them those same characteristics, maybe even give them this episode, and reduce the complexity, reduce the indecision, and increase the context and conviction in them. And this will help them rise to the occasion to execute better. It'll help them execute more quickly. It'll help empower them to be those full adults. My favorite term, Yaniv, is a full stack adult. I said that
Wow.
once in an executive meeting, and now it's everybody in the company is using this phrase. Oh, we're full stack adults, Chris. We can do this. It will empower your team to act with conviction and to benefit from that conviction across the entire org and across all of the actions you take, both small and large.
You know, we talked about courage, we talked about updating beliefs, and I think this is one of the areas as well where leaders can, through a lack of courage, I think, not be very clear about their convictions because they are worried that they're going to need to change their mind later on. At any given point in time, you need to be very clear with your team. This is what we believe. This is what we're going for. And if a few months later you change your mind and you go in a different direction, you need to be courageous enough and a skilled enough communicator to explain to your team why you're not flip-flopping, why you're not just inconsistent, but in fact, you are going through a structured process of having clear conviction and then updating your beliefs as new information comes available. But at any given point in time, if your team doesn't know what the core beliefs, the core thesis of your company is, what you have conviction in, what your vision is, then they're going to be really confused. Like, this is one of the things that goes really wrong when you talk about building empowered teams, is when you give them a lot of autonomy, but no clear view of what the organization's stance is on anything, what its vision is, what it currently believes to be true, what its current thesis is, then of course you're going to have a lot of fragmentation. You're going to have a lot of wasted work. You're going to have a lot of people at each other's throats because there is no shared context, no shared belief. So good leadership means propagating conviction. It means propagating that belief and being very, very clear and communicating it over time as those beliefs update. And that is really important. That will make everybody's decisions across the whole organization so much simpler and so much more consistent.
That's right. And Evan, we have whole episodes about how to develop great shared context for your team in the general and how to think about traction and why revenue is not necessarily the primary leading indicator that you need, and why those things can create corruption, can undermine conviction, and ultimately undermine Silicon Valley style startups with Silicon Valley style venture scale outcomes. This is all connected. It's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's all connected. So if you haven't heard those episodes, go back in the back catalog and check them out. It'll hopefully paint a nice cohesive picture for what we're talking about here.
Which Marvel character am I, Chris?
You're probably Mr. Cynical. And I'm Mr. Pollyannish.
You're clearly not very well versed in Marvel. Okay.
All right, guys. Well, that's our episode on conviction. We now have comments open on the YouTube video and on Spotify, I believe. So join us in the comments section and tell us about a time where a lack of conviction has hurt you or your company, or where you've seen a leader really inject great clarity of thinking and conviction for you. We'd love to have a discussion and join you down there in the comments.
Now, as discussed, Chris, conviction is something that's actually quite hard to build up. There are a lot of subtleties and nuances that go into doing this well, and a lot of founders find that getting some outside help is just what they need to build conviction for themselves and for their organization. So I know this is what you love to do. If people would like to work with you, how can they do that?
Oh, Yaniv, I love this stuff. I love this stuff. And I find myself doing it for a lot of founders and a lot of companies, helping them with vision, helping them with their constraints, helping them with their intuition and taste, and ultimately just accelerating all the outcomes. I have a small portfolio of companies I work with at any given time, and you can learn more about that over at chrissaad.com/advisory. Or if you're not quite ready yet, you can subscribe to my newsletter over at chrissaad.com/newsletter. And Yaniv, how can people find you on the internet?
I'm on LinkedIn, the only Yaniv Bernstein on LinkedIn, trying to make it a less boring place. And I love getting connection requests from TSP listeners. So just send me a connection request. Let me know you come from TSP, and I'd be happy to join you on there.
All right. Awesome as always. We'll catch you in the next one.
See you, Chris. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.